format rather than speeches. It's always good to chat with Eric because you don't know where to go or what you'll learn. Also, thanks for the questions that you sent in. Most of them were mature and well behaved, except for a few, and you know who you are. I had a plan for today. Very carefully looked at the questions on cards, and it was very impressive. And then I read a quote from a very wise man. Don't bother to have a plan at all. All that stuff about plans, just throw that out. If you live your life and forgo your plan, you can also forgo fear. In some sense, you have been penalized for making mistakes historically, but now you have to go out and make them because mistakes allow you to learn and innovate and try new things, and that's the true culture of innovation. Does that sound familiar?
It does.
And last night, I ran across a tweet and a post from Ray Emoto about his point of view that agencies should act like tech startups. And it brought me back to my life in agencies and about the constant sort of rift between creative people and tech people, and how would you solve that? So I'm going to ask Eric a bunch of questions, and we're going to try to put it a little bit in that context. Me coming a little bit from the traditional creative side, and him being one of the leaders of the free world.
Do I get a response here?
No responses. Okay, so let's start at the top. The future of life on Earth. Your predictions. So it's really easy these days to take a sort of the world is falling apart position.
It's always been falling apart.
It's always been falling apart. But your message is relentlessly positive to the point where you tell people graduating now they have more than a good chance of becoming the greatest generations because of things available to them.
Absolutely, it's obvious.
Talk a little bit about that.
The first comment is that we spend all of our time complaining here in the modern and sophisticated Western world. But let's talk about mankind as a whole. One of the greatest accomplishments in the last couple of decades has been the lifting of on the order of 1 billion people from absolute poverty to what we would think of as lower middle class, and from their societies as a middle class existence. And who are we to deny them the fruits that we've all grown up with? Education, and cars, and Diet Coke, and all the other things people care about. And the fact of the matter is that this is going to continue. And this face of globalization is overwhelmingly positive. Sure, it's got lots of issues. And I would argue that the exact same thing is occurring with the internet. That we've had the benefit of all of this knowledge. And so we're excited when a new smartphone comes along and it has voice translation and so forth and so on. If you're a person who has grown up in a rural village, you've not had access to textbooks and so forth, and a smartphone shows up with all the world's information available at your fingertips, literally, this is life-changing. All of a sudden, every question you could not ask before can be asked. All of the world's knowledge is available to you if you're curious. You can go in any direction you want. It's a huge shift of empowerment. And in fact, I would argue that we're going from a situation where, in certainly my lifetime, we went from a small elite that had access to pretty much the world's knowledge, and I mean a small elite, some number of millions of people, to literally 4 or 5 billion people having access in their own languages to pretty much all the world's information, good and bad. That's a huge accomplishment. We should be very proud of it. It has lots of implications for health, for education, for safety, for the interconnection of the human race.
So all those people get to use those tools for the first time, but there's another layer that you talked a little bit, you addressed it in your Carnegie Mellon speech, about, and some people might call it the consumerization of technology, or the ability for all those people not just to use that technology, but to use it to make more, and actually participate in the creation of the next.
And this is, in fact, a big change in my career. When I was growing up as a technical person, our customers were science labs and corporations because consumers had not woken up. I, for one, had no conception of how technology would really help consumers. It was a generation of people, including Larry and Sergey, Steve Jobs, other people like this, who were absolutely brilliant, who managed to figure out how to take the world of technology that we had all built up and adapt it to consumers. And what you see now is you see a consumer-led revolution. The consumers are driving technology, they're driving the economics, they're driving markets, and so forth and so on. Ultimately, it's about information, entertainment, and all the things people care about. And one of the things I learned is that the consumer market is much larger than the other market. That the information market, for example, is much larger than the IT market that I grew up in. And for many of you who are in the advertising business, this is obvious to you, but it wasn't obvious 2 decades ago. And I think the fact that this show exists and the fact that we're doing also very well, that we've got many, many billion-dollar markets ahead of us using ROI-based advertising technology is a very big deal. And a simple analysis is that if you take a country that's got 40% internet penetration and you assume in the next 5 years, because of good government policies and so forth, broadband penetration will hit 70 or 80%, your market's just doubled and you haven't changed anything. You haven't had to make your products any better, you haven't had to deal with anything, you just doubled your revenue. There are very, very few businesses where that's true. And imagine if your products are getting better and you're getting better at targeting and learning how to market to your consumer. And this is why our industry produces these extraordinary growth rates. And we take, revenue growing at 30, 40, 50% a year as some kind of slower rate. The average business is ecstatic if their business is growing 5%. Europe is going to grow between 0 and 1% in aggregate GDP, the US between 1 and 2%, and Asia on average 5 or 6%. Those are the global averages, to give you a sense of the scale of the opportunity before us. And I would argue, by the way, that the implications for this consumer-driven phenomena are not well understood. That there is a force in foreign policy because of this, that consumers are empowered in new ways. I think everybody here is quite well aware of the Arab Spring and the role of the technology helped these courageous people to bring democracy to, or at least attempt to bring democracy to countries that really did not have it before. This is just the beginning of that kind of expression of consumers.
So that's all great, but the internet obviously has the potential to be used for lots of bad.
It's always a shock to me that there are criminals using the internet. When we built the internet, we built it just for the legal people. It didn't occur to us that the criminals would be invited. So stop it. Right? You're not welcome. Only do legal things on the internet. We didn't think about all those things like security and, we had clear text email and all this. I'm obviously being facetious. What I've learned, by the way, is you have to actually say it's a joke because otherwise 140 characters is excerpted in your favorite, shall we say, tweeting engine, and off you go. But I was a joke.
So you heard it here, joke. That's been solved. So to even go further into that,
but to answer your question seriously, human activity involves good and bad activity. It's a shock that governments don't tell the truth. Who would have known? That's another joke. I have to label it. So my point here is, the internet represents human activity. And the press is obsessed with recording things that we already knew. We already knew that there were people who engaged in bad behavior. The difference is we can see it. And it's obviously not appropriate. People shouldn't do it. The thing that's missed in this discussion is that the internet is also the best way to police this sort of behavior. And especially as we develop stronger notions of identity, people who are doing literally illegal activities, it will be easier to observe them and find them and identify them and have the police and the judicial system appropriately deal with it.
So to that end, when we talk about...
And I should say, by the way, we love people using their mobile phones. Keep your mobile phones on. We're in the mobile phone business.
Thank you for that. So ubiquitous information, right? If you're in the information business and you can see into all the uses of this and the potential uses of it, it's very exciting. To a lot of people, it still feels scary. There's an emotional aspect.
Of course, because there's stuff happening that you don't have any control over. And I think a lot of this depends on your view of humankind. What we've seen is that communities of content are largely self-policing. When somebody posts an inappropriate piece of content, other people flag it within seconds. To me, these are many, many examples of the fundamental principle that the average person is a good person in trying to make the world better. Which I think is why I think we should be very optimistic about the next few decades. That the various global challenges, which we all know, are largely information problems and that they can be solved with more transparent access, broader groups, and so forth and so on. In most countries, by the way, and again, we're spoiled here in the West because we have pretty well-run, pretty legitimate and pretty honest governments. There are plenty of governments where the primary problem is one of corruption. What's the best way to solve corruption? use an e-commerce solution for procurement, use the mobile phone for payment. So now all of a sudden, all of the extra little payments and structures become exposed. And so again, the internet can serve as a discipline on the governments to become more honest, as well as an opportunity for their citizens to express themselves, learn, and educate and so forth.
So in a lot of talks and speeches, there's so many numbers and figures about things doubling and growing exponentially in scale and storage and speed and all those sorts of things. But do you, on a clean slate, what do you see out there, if anything, that seems that feels disruptive in a way that's not incremental?
The first place, it's largely mathematically it's called it's a geometric progression. Right? But basically, Moore's law means that you're doubling every roughly 2 years. So do a little math. So over 10 years, doubling every 2 years is on the order of 30-ish times of improvement. So your phone is 30 times faster, your phone is 30 times cheaper. And I should mention, by the way, that the phone is the primary development artifact going forward. Historically, people were primarily focused on mainframes and then time-sharing machines and then personal computers and browsers. And really, the next generation of interesting apps will all be phone-based with these powerful browsers and so forth that we've built. And obviously, we have our Android platform here, and the iPhone platform is very good, and the other folks as well. So the fact of the matter is, all of the really, really clever stuff is going to happen on these platforms because there's so many of them, so large market. So in that particular case, what happens is you have the geometric nature of Moore's law, so factor of 10 and factor of 30 in roughly 10 years, which means that in 20 years, it's a factor of 1,000. So again, hopefully all of us will be alive in 20 years. You can do the math. It's a big, big change. I don't think people can't really do that math in their head. So that's point one. Second thing. You're on the non-math side. We hired you.
I have to tell you, if you ever come and work at Google, when this sort of do the math with me thing happens, this is what you do.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I didn't know that was what you have been doing for the last few years. So anyway, so you have the basic Moore's law progression. But then you have other things. So you have the rate of adoption of broadband, which is some number, 30, 40% per year in terms of growth rates, depending on what studies that you do. And it's continued because people want the same things globally. They want all the information, fun, and all of that. And governments are largely doing the same thing. They're focusing on 10 megabit, 20 megabit, 100 megabit, and eventually gigabit solutions, which change everything. Then you have one more thing, which is you have a multiplier, which again you have to, and I'll help you here, you have to multiply these growth rates together. You don't add them, you multiply them, because they compound at the same rate. Okay? So then the other thing that happens is you have...
we all have different skills, Eric.
Okay. I'll help you with the formula offline. In any case, so now what you do is you add the social component. So your network of friends, the activities that you're doing, and that's also growing at a significant rate. So again, the sum of those, it's what's producing what looks like these exceptional things. They can be deceptive. They can be understood as just this thing's growing fast, this thing's growing fast, this thing's growing fast. Almost all revolutions are really evolutionary in nature. That the underlying pieces were there, and when they come together in these multiplications, right, boom, it looks like, and for the average person, it's like, oh my God, the world has changed.
I follow that. I did. Okay, let's talk about Google a bit, but put that in context. So, as tech races forward and on all fronts at the same time, how does Google keep up?
Google has always been run in a bottoms-up way. And the basic idea is that you can't centrally plan this kind of compounding that I'm describing. But you can find engineers, product managers, creative people who have a product idea that's something that they want. They want to solve some problem. And I think ultimately that's how these consumer-centric companies are really moving forward. If somebody has a problem they want to solve, that's something that's obvious to them. They see that they can take all of this data. I mean, the classic example is many people want to build voice.
Sometimes understand the motivation of the genesis.
Because it's fun.
Okay, next question.
But part of what we do should be fun. We should be very excited about these kinds of things. if you think about it, it's obvious that it's better to have your car be driven by someone other than you, right? Especially if you're drunk. And so, if you think about it, imagine over the next decade, and on a straightforward calculation, we want to minimize the number of deaths. There's going to be a point where it's fundamentally better to have self-driving cars with the person sitting at the control, right, so they feel good, but fundamentally letting the car get itself where it needs to go. It's called an autopilot. It makes sense because computers are very, very good at some things. Let's review what computers are really good at. They're very good at remembering everything. There's no delete button on the internet. It's one of those sort of issues that people have as well. They're very good at doing very precise things, and they're very good at finding needle and haystack problems. In the self-driving car, we developed a particular kind of laser, which is a local rangefinder, which can actually watch what's happening around the car. And it does it at a rate that's much faster than a human can, because there's a rate at which your eye can process things. So it's an example where computers really can do something that humans can't. Now, obviously, it's going to be a long time before computers have the kind of volition and hope and all the things that make humanity so special. And I would argue that, in fact, the correct structure is sort of a merger of the two as follows. We understand what we do really well. The computers basically do what they do very well, and we exploit that to make our lives better. So I, for example, am a student of history, I travel a lot and so forth. I'd like my computer, again, with my permission, to say, this is where you are, this is where you were, these are the things you did, these are the pictures you took, and again, with my permission, and my friend's permission, I'd like to hear from where they are and what they're doing and so forth. This is obvious if you think about it. They're very good at that, and we're not very good about that. And again, with cloud computing, which of course is the underlying technical trend here, these servers have something to do, right? Store all those memories, do all that analysis, and come up with some interesting results. The general term for this, by the way, is called data mining. And the fact of the matter is that huge amounts of data are being generated by people's activity online. And again, in our view, and speaking for Google, with your permission, some of that information will be very useful to make your life better.
And I can tell you it is fun. I had the chance to, I don't know what I was doing, driving it perhaps, sitting in the back seat with my phone.
But it's an interesting thing that they do the test where you try to drive it, and then it drives faster and more precisely than you. And that's usually the thing that surprises people. And before we get into spend all day talking about cars, I should say that one of the principles that Sergey established very early in the company was the 70-20-10 principle. So we spend 70% of our energy on our core business, which is essentially search, ads, display, that sort of stuff. 20% on adjacent businesses. Historically, that was Gmail. That's probably more fundamental now. So forth, and 10% on other. And we argue that the other is very important because a lot of the most creative ideas, most of the futuristic things, in fact, come from people who are unconstrained by the existing sort of zeitgeist and rules of society with respect to what technology can be used for.
You mentioned Sergey. So Larry took on the CEO role this year, and I find that not many people really know Larry, and I'm curious just because I think people become curious about what's in Larry's head, how does Larry think. Can you give a little insight? You spent a lot of time.
Well, of course, I spent 7 days a week for 10 years with Larry and Sergey. And what happened in our case was that we had been running things sort of as a triumvirate, and as the company got larger, it was harder and harder to sort of figure out who the decision makers were. And as companies scale, time to decision is the most important thing. So over Christmas, we actually talked about it, and we decided to reallocate. And after a decade, I'm very happy to have Larry be the CEO and me being the chairman, and I get to work on some of the things that I really couldn't do before. And Larry is the world's best product manager, in my opinion. He's just an extraordinarily gifted product person. So he thinks essentially all of the key product decisions were driven by Larry or through Larry in the decade that I was CEO. And I think you'll see the impact of it over time. And the other skills are ones that he developed with me. So I think you'll see a continuity from a leadership perspective. The thing that will happen is you'll get even better products as a result of Larry's CEO-ship.
I think it's really true. I mean, even from watching Larry from afar, he has an ability to separate himself into person running company and just a user using computer. So if he sees
I
something
think many successful founder CEOs are like that. I think if you look at the other ones who've done very well, they all have that gift, and I think it's good that Larry has that gift.
So what do you think people's biggest challenges are in the next couple of years?
It's always, in a company like Google, an established company of significant scale, the biggest problems are always internal. And this is always a surprise because people in the press and people who cover markets always assume that your primary problem is a competitor. But in essentially every competitive issue that we have, right, and there's a long list, we had the technology that someone inside the company had thought about or developed, but we failed to act quickly enough. We failed to see it, we failed to invest in it, we failed to understand it, and so forth and so on. And I think that's true of all large companies, and I would say, and certainly in the IT business. And what happens in the traditional arc of IT companies, tech companies anyway, is a small period where they're a startup and everything's being established, and this huge hockey stick of growth, which is caused by this compounding that we were discussing earlier, where you have to do the math. So that's called an S-curve, a hypergrowth period, and then a gradual slowing. And the way you can forestall that in a large company is you can have a series of such curves. So I would argue, for example, that Android can be understood, and it's in a hypergrowth phase, as another extension of that hypergrowth period. And again, we benefit as a corporation from that. So you need to constantly have those things. And as long as you have them, you're just fine.
So, you're a Super Bowl advertiser.
Yes, this was your fault.
Okay.
Did you have a question?
Well, I'm curious, how did that all come to be? That's still a little unclear.
Well, you and I never actually discussed this, so it's better if I just tell you all. So what happens is we're sitting in a staff meeting, and Lorraine, who does all the marketing, comes over and says, we need to show you this because we're going to show it to the board. And I go, what? And they show a Super Bowl ad. And I go, hell has frozen over. Because in the decade I've been at the company, we would never have thought that there was value in that. And I thought, somebody must have had a screw loose or something. And, so how did this all occur? Of course, it was your fault. And so we actually showed this to the board, and they liked it. I went, oh my God. And what was interesting about it was the narrative is actually much more interesting because what happened, of course, which is a little bit of praise for you, is that we allowed the market to choose the ad. That the ads that we had to choose from had been produced by your shop, and we looked at the ones that were the most popular. So a very interesting insight, that you could put your ads on YouTube, and people could actually, you could see which ones work. Now, I had no ability to figure out which ad is going to work better than the other, and it's obvious by my earlier comments. But I think even the creative people don't necessarily know which of the three that they like are going to be most popular. So the internet could be used to support them. You did. Okay. Well, you still use the internet to confirm your bias. So in any case, when we showed this ad, everybody said this was fine, and Larry and Sergey, after some discussion, decided to do this. We then measured the ad. And the question was, we paid a whole bunch of money to CBS at the time to advertise. The question was it a good business investment? And so because we have the ability to measure search traffic, we actually looked at the incremental search traffic that we got from a particular Persian ad, and it paid for itself. Isn't that shocking? That at the end of the day, we took something which was a Super Bowl ad, and we turned it into an ROI phenomenon.
And people liked it.
That's also true.
Okay, so to the industry, to the wider industry a little bit. When we put up the questions, the moderator, there's a lot of interest in mobile payment systems, digital currency. How does that affect things? How does that change things? Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think let's talk a little bit about the benefit of the cloud. So everybody here has their credit cards and a wallet and a mobile phone with you, and every single person in this audience, in her purse or in his wallet, sort of has all that kind of stuff. What would happen if all of that was in your phone? Well, first place, you wouldn't lose your phone. It's important to know. As you did the transactions, there would be a record of the stuff that you did in the cloud and services and so forth and so on. So is there any value to that? Yeah, there actually is. So now let's think about this some more. So I'm here in Cannes. I want to buy, a t-shirt because it's hot or so forth, and I'm walking down the street. What I really think is I want my phone to understand my brand preference. In my case, I don't think I have one, but imagine if I did. And I'm walking down the street, and I want it to say, on the left, you can get this particular brand, 20% off. On the right, you can get this other brand, 30% off. It's in euros, it does the calculation for me. I choose based on pictures and offers on my phone, or maybe it makes a recommendation based on my past history, again with my permission. And then I turn left or turn right, I walk into the store, and I say, I want the t-shirt, and somehow it already knows that they want it, or somehow I walk in and I tap my phone on one of these tap and pay terminals, so I don't even have to get a credit card out, and they hand me the shirt. Now, how big a market is that? Many, many, many billions. It's probably $1 trillion market over time, because of the scale of retail commerce and so forth. Google is the first company, to my knowledge, to be able to integrate all of that together. What I just described to you was the Android phone, the Google Wallet, a series of affinity cards and credit cards and so forth, the cloud services behind it, the settlement systems with various card authorizers, including here in Europe, the offers mechanism where you can offer discounting, and then very, very targeted advertising. Now you say, well, how does Google make money here? We make money on the ads. We don't make money on the transaction. We're in the ads business. And we obviously believe in ROI targeted ads. How valuable is an ad that gets somebody to walk into a store and buy the product right there? You can imagine it's going to be a very, very good business for us and for you all as well as advertisers.
So a question about, and back to the sort of merging of so-called creative talent and tech talent together. You talked a little bit about this model of online advertising becoming iterative. The notion of not perfect and release, but rather experiment and add. Talk a little bit about that.
I think the fact of the matter is that if you look at these online sites that are doing so well, all of them fundamentally are fast change cycles. What happens is every day, every week, they're morphing. And it's a curious thing about all of us that we don't notice these changes. So, as an example, take any one of your favorite sites, Facebook, Twitter, Google, what have you, and look at it a year ago. Or take a picture of it, and a year from now look at it, and you'll see how much it's changed. And you haven't noticed it because, like a child that grows up, it has continued to grow. So, the most successful online models seem to be iterative. We've seen the same thing with our advertising partners. That what happens is they're constantly trying to figure out, using the best tools available, how to target the market. And they measure what works, and then they iterate. And the most successful people come in with suspicions but without a bias. In other words, I suspect this will work, but I'm not prejudiced against this approach. And they try this and so forth. We often do a 1% test at Google. We will try something for 1% of our users, and we measure it. Or in some cases, we'll do a holdback. We'll do a 90% conversion, but we'll keep 10% or even a 99% conversion, and we'll keep 1% back so we can measure, again, analytically, whether it worked or not. And this is a classic example of the merger of the sort of creative arts and the measurement arts. I fundamentally believe that the creative process, you cannot know what's going to happen at the beginning, but you can certainly measure how well it works. And traditional industries have done this. They measure audiences, they can count people, and so forth. It's interesting, that people are worried about the role that Netflix is playing and the impact on movie distribution model and so forth. But what I think is the secret of Netflix is Netflix knows its customers because it has a direct relationship with its customers, and then based on all that information, it can figure out better movies for you. I use Netflix as an example because it's not a business that we're currently in, and it's one that's sort of very interesting, right? Because it allows them to sort of talk directly to their consumer and figure out how to do it better. There are many such businesses in the online world, and I think most of us, and all of us in the advertising business, will be working through those channels. Some company, Google or a competitor or a partner or whatever, will know a customer really well. And what you want to do is take the profile that they're generating of that information, and you want to get a very relevant ad. And we strongly believe that advertising has value. We believe that relevant ads are worth the money. We also believe that untargeted ads are not worth very much. The classic example being that on traditional television, the television doesn't know whether there's a baby at home, whether you need diapers supplied to the home or not. So why does it show diapers ads? It doesn't make any sense. The television should know. And in fact, the next generation of televisions, including Google TV and so forth, have the ability to say something about the information and so forth that people really want to consume. So even in television, we can begin to get started.
You know, just it's sometimes, particularly if you're not in the business every day, hard to sort of take everything that's coming at you and organize it into some sort of buckets that you can actually carry around with you.
But a platform for other people to build on. So let me give you some examples of other companies. A company called Zynga is by far the most popular online gaming company. It primarily runs on the platform of a company called Facebook. So Facebook, which we think of as an online communications group, social network and so forth and so on, is in fact a platform. It's obvious if you think about Apple, which of course makes brilliant products, and I say this as a proud former board member, is also a platform, that they have a huge developer program and so forth and so on. If you take a look at Amazon, Amazon again has this large platform, and indeed they offer developer services, billing services, and they have a platform for selling both physical and virtual goods. And of course Google is well understood as a platform. The trick is that you get these underlying waves that I was describing earlier, and you have a platform upon which other people can invest their money. I mentioned those four because in our industry, we've never had four companies at the size and scale of those four growing that rapidly as platforms. And that's one of the reasons, and we've always had fast-growing startups, candidates for a fifth, you could call them the Fab Five, if you will. Twitter could be a candidate, Netflix could be a candidate, there's others. But they all have the property that they're growing very quickly and they're building a platform for others to build on. And that's where ultimately, in my view, shareholder wealth is created. It's ultimately where these ecosystems are established, and they are immense because of the compounding of the internet. Another way to say this is that 20 years ago, before Netscape and all of that, it was very difficult to get in 1 year an audience of 100 million people. You had to do a deal with Microsoft, which was very difficult. You had to come up with some software distribution mechanism and so forth to really get embedded in that distribution model. The internet broke all those models. And the fact that you can now reach consumers directly in this consumer-led industry that we're in means that not only are the ones that I named, in my view, the interesting platforms of today, but there will be new ones, and the new ones will emerge even faster than the ones I named. So don't be surprised when another one comes, and another one comes, and another one, as we get even better at this area.
Okay, so all these platforms are going like mad exponentially. I will work out the math. And I ran across this stat. In 2 years, information will double every 11 hours. Okay, that's great. But and we've had this conversation before because I know you're interested in this thought. Will any of us be any smarter? I mean, will I do fewer dumb things? Will we?
That's a specific case question.
We could talk that could also be offline.
Let's talk about the source of the growth number first,
okay.
Because I think it's worth stating that because everybody has a mobile phone that now is essentially a recording device, that logs information, and that you post information on Facebook and others, the overwhelming growth rate in information is user-generated. The most recent statistic is, I think, 48 hours of YouTube videos submitted every minute or so, some number of billions of views per day. I mean, these are massive amounts of data. If you look at Android phones, with 100 million phones used, these are very, very large numbers. And those numbers all compound. So the way you get to that kind of growth number, which I agree is terrifying, by the way, just sort of a scale problem, is you understand that most of this comes from user-generated information, and therefore it's new and transient. It's where I was, what I did, it's a picture of me, it's a picture of my friends, that kind of stuff. It's not the same thing as book information, or library information, or the traditional professional media, which produces at a much slower rate. So the search problem, and we love this statistic because it means that search becomes more important, and Google's search is what Google does fundamentally, because no human can get through all of that. There are many statistics that if you take essentially the current growth rate of the small terabit disks, and eventually you'll have a petabyte disk. A petabyte is much larger than a gigabyte. You you can put 600 years of video on it that you would run at DVD quality for 24 hours in 10 years. So of course you'll never be able to watch all that video, but you can carry it around and feel good. You can feel wealthy even though you can't actually spend the money, right? Because it's all there. It's literally it's incomprehensible at a human level. And that's, I think, that will happen. So it becomes a search problem, it becomes a navigation problem. And I think one of the things to say about Google is that we need to move beyond the 10 links answer model. The type the query and give the answers. The best would be if Google knew what you wanted without you having to type it in. And you sit there and you go, well, how could we do that? Well, again, with a mobile phone, there are ways of getting it more. We love mobile phones. Keep the ringing going. With your mobile phone, we know, again, with your permission and so forth, we can trigger search queries like where you are, where you've been, those sorts of things, and give you an approximation of that based on what you're interested in. So that's an obvious one. The less obvious one, but I think even more important, is that artificial intelligence at the server level can take this data and begin to understand things that you care about. So since you'll never be able to watch all the videos, if we have the equivalent of your social graph, we can help select videos that you should watch. And based on what you watch and demographics about yourself and your preferences and other things you tell us, as well as information that your friends are doing, which has been anonymized, so it's not a privacy violation for them, we can actually suggest literally infinite television. We can have TV, TV, and TV. And I think one of the other things that's happening is you have, with the broadband revolution, you have gigabit Ethernet, internet coming out. And with gigabit internet, the distinctions between broadcast television and radio and DVDs and cable, all of that goes away. It's just bits. So at that point, all those models become pricing models. You pay a bundle and you get the subscription, you get a bundle, you get that subscription, and the transport is the same. And that means a complete blending of your choice. I have a connection, I plug it in, and then what do I pay to get this professional content or this search?
So so the hope is that even with all that information, that we ultimately maybe get us less information, but the right information.
Well, again, the goal of computers is to serve us, not the other way around. What we're talking is that we're floppy. We're sort of creating all of this information that nobody will ever use. You want the information to be useful. Again, computer algorithms from Google and others can help select what you care about. We're now experimenting with all sorts of examples. In Gmail, there's something called a priority inbox. Since most of us are overwhelmed by email, it tries to pick the emails that we think, based on a whole bunch of factors, are the ones that you care about the most. People are overwhelmed by spam and pseudo-spam and false identities and people who just bug you.
Yeah. So with a couple minutes left, I'm just curious, from your experience, 10 years running Google, the amazing things that have happened, a whole lifetime of science and leading people in projects and really revolutions. Through all that, what's the best piece of advice that you've ever gotten about anything? Not anything particular, but what stands out?
The best piece of advice I've ever gotten is to try to say yes. The power of yes is really, I think, not understood. We get into this sort of negative, cyclic culture in the media, in our own conversations. Oh, woe is me, it's this problem. I mean, come on, guys, you're in the south of France. It's a great place. Let's be happy. So try to say yes. Yes is how you get your first job. It's how you get your promotion. It's how you have a relationship. You get married, you have children. Yes is how your life evolves. It's how you learn new things and so forth. And luck occurs, if you're prepared for it, by focusing on trying to say yes to that thing that came along the side. That was an opportunity that might not come by again, and so forth and so on. I think that's really true. I would argue, by the way, that you have a couple of trends globally that are fundamentally supportive of this positive view that I have of the future, which I guess is counter to most commentators. The first is that the fundamental shift to globalization, in addition to raising living standards for people, is a shift to cities and more urban things. And you say, oh, that's terrible, cities are crowded, and so forth. Not correct. Cities are the creative engines of the world. You're getting all those people together, mixing all those identities, mixing all those people, and so forth. Somehow the proximity of people in cities globally create new opportunities for business and culture and so forth and so on. The second thing that you have is you have the sort of virtual cities that are being created on the internet. These are obviously different kinds of cities, but communities driven by either social networks or other aspects or communities of interest, where people can share information so very quickly. So all of the evidence says that what's new is time compression, that everything happens faster now, but that the bias is positive. And I would argue that sure, there's issues and so forth, and we have to figure out how to run the economic system a little bit better, and deal with the joblessness issue in the West. There's a number of security issues that I think are well understood. But the fact that we're talking about them, the fact that everybody's aware of them, the fact that people are demanding more transparency from their governments, the fact that people are getting wired together as a sum means that the sort of the collective humankind working in cities and being this creative, and again, using the power of yes, being open to new ideas, really does drive a new dawn, if you will. This is the beginning, I would argue, of a new era of the internet based on these factors. And I'm very excited to be part of it. I think it's a tremendously optimistic view from my perspective.
It's great. Well, we're getting the red zero. And the red zero means we have to leave, even though I'd love to sit and keep talking. And,
well, thank you very much, Andrew.
And thank you all.
Please continue doing creative things for us.
I will keep working on my math. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all. Enjoy your lunch.